Good afternoon. First of all, welcome to the last session of this class for the semester. As you guys probably remember, as you guys should remember, the chapter was about sexuality across the lifespan. And one thing that I found really interesting from the lectures was the idea of menopause and why it would be even important for women to live after menopause. And so the study that I found today was called Grandma Plays Favorites: X-chromosome relatedness and sex-specific childhood mortality. It was published by Fox et al. In 2010, and they're a German group, which is why it's spelled a little weird. The question I was most interested in looking at during the course of my research and thinking about what I wanted to look at in this presentation was, what is the purpose of living past one's reproductive years? The average age of menopause is in the late 40s, early 50s, and women tend to live almost into their 70s and 80s. What's the purpose of those several decades of life beyond your reproductive years when you can't have children anymore? One hypothesis that has come up to kind of explain this idea of post-reproductive life is the grandmother hypothesis, which states that postmenopausal women can increase their genetic contribution to future generations by increasing the survivorship of their grandchildren. One way that this is postulated to occur is, as you can see in this picture, by perhaps that grandmothers can provide nutrition and help providing nutrition for their grandchildren. As we all know, most of us kind of fantasize about grandma's home-cooked meals and things like that. There are other ways, especially in modern society, that grandmothers can contribute to the survivorship of their children. And one way that you can think kind of in modern times is that as more and more women and men, as more and more two-parent households are both in the workforce, grandmothers can help with childcare, and in that way benefit their grandchildren. Interestingly, however, most studies that have looked into this have reported conflicting results, showing that only the presence of the maternal grandmother has a positive impact on children, and often that the paternal grandmother being around has either slightly positive, slightly negative, or neutral consequences for grandchildren. The interesting thing about the study that I will be presenting today is that it kind of shows a way that you can resolve these conflicts, and actually went back at old studies, and after going through the methods that I will describe in this specific study, went and looked at how to resolve the conflicts seen in other studies and redid their statistics as a way of showing that perhaps there isn't this big conflict that I just talked about. One way that you can think about this is through the idea of X-chromosome relatedness. For those of you who might need a refresher on genetics, I'm going to go through it a little bit quickly right now. So first, let's take the example of the paternal grandmother. As you can see here, the paternal grandmother has two X chromosomes and the grandfather has one X and one Y. If they then go on to have a son, the grandmother has a 50% chance of sending that yellow X chromosome to her son. If he then goes on to have a son, then there's no chance that that son will get the same yellow X chromosome because he'll get his X chromosome from his mother. On the other hand, if the father has a daughter, she'll get one X chromosome from her mother and another X chromosome from her father, which means, and because he only has one X chromosome to give her, that means that the overall level of X chromosome relatedness between the grandmother and her grandson or granddaughter are different. Specifically, that there's a 0% chance that the X chromosomes of the grandmother and the grandson on the paternal side are related, and there's a 50% chance that the X chromosome of the grandmother and the granddaughter on the paternal side are related. On the other hand, let's look at the maternal grandmother side. The same way, there's one X and one Y for the grandfather and two X's for the grandmother. When they have a daughter, each of them will get one X, and that daughter has a 50% chance of getting the purple gene, purple X, from her mother. If she then goes on to have a son, that son will definitely get her X, he will have a 50% chance of getting an X chromosome, the purple X chromosome, from his mother. And if she has a daughter, that daughter also has a 50% chance of getting the purple X chromosome. So as you can see, the grandson has a 25% overall chance of having the same X chromosome, the same purple X chromosome as his maternal grandmother, and the granddaughter has another 25% chance of getting the same purple X chromosome from his maternal grandmother. Based on this idea that there are different values of the X chromosome relatedness by paternal and maternal grandmothers and grandchildren, they came up with the following hypothesis. Specifically, Fox et al. Hypothesized that having the paternal grandmother with her grandchild living close together would be the most beneficial, whereas having a paternal grandmother being around her grandson would be the least beneficial, and that having the maternal grandmother around would be beneficial for both, but somewhere in the middle. And interestingly, if you think about this, if this hypothesis proves to be true, that could be a way of explaining the conflicting results, in the sense that maternal grandmothers should be slightly beneficial for both the boy and the girl. So that would lead to positive results. Whereas if it's very beneficial for a paternal grandmother to be around and not beneficial for a paternal grandmother to be around her grandson, then it could lead to conflicting results based on what the gender balance in each study was. I know that was a little confusing, so if you have questions, feel free to ask. The methods of this study were really interesting in a way. What they did was collected data over several centuries from 7 different countries. So from Canada, England, Germany, Gambia, Ethiopia, Japan, and Malawi. And they collected this data from almost the 1600s to the 1700s in some societies, and almost the 1900s to 2000s in other societies. So it was like a very longitudinal study in the sense. They got their data from census records, population records, church records, and other things that indicated where grandmothers were living either in the same house or the same village as their grandchildren, or where the grandmothers were either deceased or not living in the same area as their grandchildren. And then by getting this data, what they looked at was what the childhood mortality rate of the children that they studied was when the grandmother was either present or not present. The results were really interesting, and I'll explain them really quickly, going through each of the 7 countries and then show you kind of a summary slide. So in Germany, you can see here that the gray is the girl and the black part is the boy. And so if it is on the right side of this line, that means that there was an overall positive effect, and if it's on the left side, that means it was an overall negative effect. So as you can see here, we'll just be looking at the general trend for now. As you can see here, the only place where having a grandmother around was negative was when the paternal grandmother was with her grandson in Germany. In England, you can see as well that the only negative effect was when the paternal grandmother was with her grandson. The same happened in Ethiopia, and in Canada, and in Japan. In Gambia, there was a slight difference in that the paternal grandmother had a negative effect on both of her children. And in Malawi, there was a slightly different effect in that the paternal grandmother had a negative effect on her grandson, and also the maternal grandmother had a negative impact on her granddaughter. However, overall, the results were pretty significant. As you can see here, in every country, boys survived better with their maternal grandmother compared to the paternal grandmother. In slightly more than half of the countries, girls survived better with the paternal grandmother, whom they're 50% related to, X chromosome-wise, than the maternal grandmother. And in all but one country, the paternal grandmother was better for girls than for boys, which, if you remember, paternal grandmother was 50% related to her granddaughter. Maternal grandmother was 25% related to her granddaughter. This is a really interesting finding. However, there are definitely limitations to be considered within this study. The first is the idea of neonatal mortality. Because they used so many different forms of getting the data, and there wasn't really standardization about what age group they looked at and whether they accounted for what the neonatal mortality levels were in each of the countries. For example, let's say if in Gambia they had a much higher infant mortality rate than in England. That could contribute to the difference in mortality rates in general. The other idea is the idea of generalizability and cultural influences. Because these were over a really long time period, it's definitely possible that historical events might have also influenced the results. However, it's also really important to think that if across 7 pretty different countries over a really, really long time span, despite the fact that there might be so many different historical influences and biological influences, if there is such a strong correlation between the difference in in the gender of the child and their mortality level, and also the influence of the paternal versus maternal grandmother, this might be something that's pointing to an evolutionary basis of the grandmother hypothesis. So it's interesting to think of how this might happen. One idea that's been hypothesized is that it could be a behavioral adaptation, that grandmothers are somehow inclined to behave differently towards different grandchildren, depending on their gender, depending on their relationship with them. The other thing that might happen is, and perhaps this could be mediated by something like physical resemblance. And one way that it's been hypothesized to occur, one way that it's been hypothesized to occur is maybe through pheromones, that perhaps grandmothers can detect there's something within them that can sense where they're more related to their grandchildren, and kind of tend to favor them that way. Overall, though, the study seems to point to the idea that the effect that grandmothers have on their grandchildren parallels the X-relatedness between them. Thank you.